Hi everyone, welcome back, and we are going to be discussing the television in further details continuing from the previous class. So, we are looking at the shifts in the television industry and how it has shaped the idea of content, especially news, and also what would be seen as entertainment. One can also notice that the shift has been from development oriented content into more consumerist kind of content. So, as we were discussing the history of television in the Indian context, we also have to talk about caste based, regional and religio-political groups who increasingly shape media content using their claims of cultural authenticity rather than public interest norms. So, it is very much plausible that a group says that our sentiments and cultural sensibilities are hurt. So, please do not broadcast this, and this is where how the society, the state, the political social groups, they play a key role in directing what would also be seen as television content or even other forms of media content. Market-led modernization accommodates such regulations, while media corporations continue to prioritize elite audiences. So, when we say elite audiences, it means generally hegemonic ideas of who the audience is. So, the content is primarily marketed towards a particular way in which we think about our social world. Earlier scholarship had emphasized state dominance, though actual TV audiences were quite limited during that period. And one could see that rapid growth in broadcasting occurred after the deregulation, with television becoming near utility for the middle classes. In fact, at one point of time, it also becomes a symbol of middle class aspiration and desire, because to own a television set means that you are a member of the middle class. Electronic media were seen as tools for mass education and national development, which operated under a developmentalist framework to build consensus without coercion. So, this is why when we think about what Chomsky would argue as the propaganda model, that propaganda is something which is ideological, it is hidden within the content itself. And these efforts largely failed, as primarily media could not address diverse local needs or respond effectively to the audience context. So, when the propaganda of development is introduced as ideology, there are also unmet needs, because there is a failure to understand the audience context, there is a failure of outreach, etc. So, this dominance of Doordarshan lasted until 1991, which shaped early programming, but with the entry of transnational broadcasting, there were changes. The second phase saw this growth of commercial television, which we have been talking about, and even in this stage, the state continued its attempts at bringing about ideas of nationalism and developmentalism through some of the content that they broadcasted. For instance, there were soap operas like Hum Log, which attempted to merge education and entertainment, but the audience response was shaky, taking us back to the earlier point about how there was no understanding of the audience context, and therefore, there was also in that sense reduced emphasis on developmental programming and messaging further ahead. By 2010, television became a very dominant mass medium in India, with a rapid expansion in local channels, high household penetration and also widespread preference for TV entertainment. The TV became a part of one's everyday life, as we had discussed, especially during, let us say, evening hours, you have discussions, you watch television together, etc. Now, economic liberalization led to a deterritorialized media control, where there was also foreign investment alongside strong localization of content in Indian languages. So, one could see that foreign investors were taking an interest in the Indian broadcasting industry, and at the same time there were also ways in which there was a juxtaposition of global content with a local content. So, you would have a channel like HBO, but you would also have Aaj Tak. Television growth has been accompanied by cross-media ownership and content flow across film, radio, print, TV and the cell phone challenging the idea of media as isolated forms. So, this is also a very important theoretical and conceptual point, that media is not isolated and there is coexistence of these media forms. Cultural norms in media are very context dependent, shaped by what is considered permissible rather than fixed beliefs, especially in a society where social political conditions have and rights have preceded social reform. This means that while the television is a modern form of communication and it enters a society, they may have social political rights, but they may not have yet had social reform as it should be. There is something of which sociologists would call a cultural lag that exists, that the law, your rights, they have sort of moved ahead, but the society hasn't. So, in that context, the content is also very specifically dependent on the social. So, you will notice that in many cases when there are serials that you can watch on YouTube, there are certain words which are blurred out, or there would be certain body parts which are hidden. This is a sign of how the blurring, the dubbing, the taking out reflects noticing the cultural sensibilities of a particular audience, that a particular audience may not be okay with what is being broadcasted in another audience. Television must be understood within a wider network of domestic, political and media spheres, which require a very decentered approach to understand it. So, we are trying to make sense of this huge change in history in terms of the entry of a media and a communication form, and what kind of changes does it lead to in social behavior. Today, we see sensationalism has proliferated television, and this public-private opposition has been reversed because of how the television has also become very big part of how we think about our private lives. And we have been discussing this transformation of the public sphere from a rational critical debate site into one that is marked by popular culture, mass culture, etc. What is also happening is that processes of self-fashioning and subject formations have become more public, particularly when this idea of literacy is recent. So, these are societies in India, in most of South Asia, where literacy is a recent concept, and we were talking about how reading and writing are again recent skills. So, what is needed is also not just literacy, but literacy to understand these media and communication. So, for instance, why would people, when they watch televised versions of Hindu epics, think that the actor playing the role of Shri Krishna actually is Shri Krishna, is primarily showing us how that media literacy is still something which needed to be thought of. Now, essentially one can also see a shift in how content becomes personalized in television, where stories about personal lives, particularly celebrity lives, become very sensationalized, and media sort of represents it in a way where it is taken to the consumers to be consumed as content. So, when a celebrity wedding happens, the coverage that is reflected is exactly what is being talked about when we say that the person and the personalized discourse becomes very important. Indian television news media is growing at an exponential rate, and both private and foreign players have pushed Doordarshan's monopoly and taken over the broadcasting industry. And what can also be seen is that there is a creation of a hybrid media system because of the convergence of print, broadcasting and digital media. So, what we also see is that news programming has shifted from the one way monologic dissemination to debates and discussions, where you have panel discussions, opinion polls, telephonic calls allowed. Today, people are also able to voice their suggestions and opinion on YouTube comments, on Instagram comments, etc. So, you see a convergence of technological, economic, social, political factors and a very hybrid media system. Media continues to play a critical role in shaping the Indian nation, particularly how it interacts with social institutions like family, caste, class, religion, gender and community. So, what we have is actually a very commercial culture rooted in its history with television, and in one way this has been connected to concerns about the weakening of the democratic public sphere, which was a site for rational critical debate. The digital media and the internet have actually become expanded spaces where one sees the plurality of public sphere, and one sees that television and talk shows actually enhance what would be called deliberative democracy, where new spaces are created for political discussion and action. This is a critique of the idea that democratization of the public sphere and introduction of mass media has meant the erosion of its public rational critical nature, primarily arguing that the inclusion of diverse voices, especially vernacular presses and different kinds of media expansion, has actually enabled the participation of marginalized groups and challenged the elite dominance that has existed in traditional forms of media. So, the idea is actually to also say that the critique that the democratic ideas of access, representation, etc. And expansion have challenged the rational critical nature of the public sphere and media is actually misled, because now we have more representative voices, we have more media content. For instance, what digital media has also done is allowed YouTube to become a platform where people could voice their opinions and also create content. They are not traditional journalists by any means, because they are not part of media rooms, media houses, they have not had media training, but then again they do the job in many cases. Now, when we think about television news in India, it emerged as a tool for nation building and national integration, which Doordarshan was using for promoting economic and social development. But we also see that market driven revenue models based on advertising, these were introduced with the changes that were brought about in 1991. Now, there are several strategies of content generation like segmentation, replication, infotainment, and they became central to how television news would be presented. The distinction between Hindi and English news channels in content, audience and revenue has also reduced, because there is more similarity in the formats that they are adopting. Now, English news channels also increasingly use Hindi and English, because they also want to expand their viewership because of the larger Hindi news market that is there in the Indian context. So, we also have shrill debates, we have agenda driven content and the pursuit of high ratings. So, these are all ways in which television news has undergone changes. Now, when we are thinking about the television industry and some of these changes, we also have to think about the ownership. Now, when it comes to ownership, this is actually very important, that when we think about these private players, most of them are big business personnel as well as politicians. Now, that also, according to media theorists like Noam Chomsky and others, would be seen as problematic. Problematic because when we think about a media as the fourth pillar of democracy or as the fourth estate, the role of media is supposed to be bringing neutral, objective facts and content to the masses. However, once ownership is driven by certain agenda or a certain way in which news is generated and collected and then portrayed, there emerges a way in which we can see that the mass media in its nature, its objectivity gets compromised. Now, Chomsky calls this nexus between business, politics and media houses, where he says that the sources that you take the news from to make your news newsworthy is itself compromised, because these sources are generally either government sources or corporate sources and they cannot represent the objective truth. He also suggest that when consent is manufactured, where there is a manufacturing of what is seen as consensuals, what is news, what is newsworthy, there is a model at work which basically thrives on some of these characteristics. One of these characteristics which Chomsky talks about is also how there is a revenue interest driven media houses, primarily because they are generating their revenue by gathering advertisement and other kind of financial support from specific media houses. So, what again then happens is that there is a compromise in how news itself is relayed. One can see that media houses in most democratic societies today have undergone shifts, and one can also see that when we are thinking about television, news becomes really important when we are thinking about this history of television. However, television has also had other kinds of content, particularly as we were discussing serials and entertainment. Today, when we see a shift in the way that this content is shaping, one can also notice that there has been a shift from development oriented content to what would be seen as entertainment. The 1990s saw the rise of television serials, which became very popular. Today we also have the proliferation of reality shows. We have shows centered around music, around dance, around sports, around adventure sports, around investment ideas. And these shows create a sense of reality which is then televised. One can also see how the nature of the audience has changed, because now they actually want to also watch content which they think is real, but is still televised. So, this very idea of these reality shows which captures the way that people live in their everyday lives is rooted in how people would want to ask and see these representations. Television has come a long way in the Indian context. Now, one can also see lot of vernacular television channels, not only of news, but also entertainment, and people are watching television serials at their leisure time, and there is also a possibility of watching the episode in repeat because you have OTT platforms which are connected to some of these channels, and then they run the content on OTT platforms later. Similarly, what is also happening is that there is this kind of intersection between the OTT platforms and television content, where one is also increasingly finding events like cricket matches, other sports events, etc., getting live streamed on these OTT platforms. The nature of the television also underwent a change when live events began to be telecasted, primarily through sporting events like Olympics, etc., because people realized for the first time that they could watch events which were happening in real time on their television sets, and that was one of the foundational moments of how content was also brought to us immediately. This is connected to how the nature of interaction has fundamentally changed following the capturing of live events. Today, these live events can be captured through video calls, through photographs, through videos, and they can freeze time. But television was actually one of the first medium which had made it possible to freeze time and space through these telecasts of live events like Olympics, Cricket World Cup, etc. They also managed to create a sense of what would be that imagination of a community centered on feeling that you belonged to a particular nation state. While Benedict Anderson writes in the context of print capitalism and the print media, one can see that a very similar role is also played by the television. For instance, the way that India's victory in the 1983 Cricket World Cup, Men's Cricket World Cup was celebrated, and those visuals were shown again and again, and they would be carried forward generationally, generating that pride in the way that the Indian men's cricket team won the World Cup. Similarly, what had happened in the 2007 T20 World Cup, when India won the World Cup for the first time, and there were these visuals which were a part of household conversations in terms of the match also being replayed again and again, primarily to elicit those kinds of emotional moments. The television has also been a site where it was possible to watch very different kinds of events, like funerals of big people, popular celebrities, etc., as well as get to know a side of celebrities like film stars who use the television space to communicate with their audience. So, in many of these shows, while people acknowledge that there is a certain sense of acting and staging, it also made possible communication in a way where it was possible to take it beyond what you read about them or how you saw them in the films. It was possible to interact with them in real time. In many reality shows, in many comedy shows, in many promotional shows, there was also a possibility of interacting directly with the film stars or the television stars. So, one can see that this dawning of a new era through the television primarily introduced us to newer kinds of social behavior and interaction. So, while the character of the news changed, and this has been explained through a political economy approach, there were also other ways in which the television brought about these fundamental social, psychological, behavioral changes, and these have been captured in multiple ways by scholars like Arvind Rajagopal and others, who look at the role of the television as a very powerful medium in influencing how public opinion is shaped. One can also see that television will undergo very different kinds of changes as we move more into the digital era, and we will continue these discussions. Thank you.